Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding the hearing, and I appreciate hearing from our colleagues in North Dakota. I only wish we could figure out a way to directionally drill up into the oil in North Dakota and bring it down into South Dakota. But I've often said that North Dakota has oil, Wyoming has coal, Montana has some of both, and South Dakota we have pheasants. But we also raise a lot of agricultural commodities. We raise corn, wheat, and soybeans, and we have to have a way to get that to the marketplace, and that requires railroad. It's the most efficient way to move freight like agricultural commodities. And our state has been so interested over the years in this subject that back in the late 1970s, when the railroads were abandoning South Dakota, the Milwaukee Road and the Chicago Northwestern, our state had to take some pretty drastic action. They imposed a temporary sales tax and actually acquired the railroad, not the power and the rolling stock, but the track, the rails, the ties, the right-of-way, and all that, and then contracted for operations with Burlington Northern, at that time Burlington Northern, now BNSF Railroad, to operate that railroad. So it's been now since then back privatized to the Burlington Northern, but it's an example, I think, of what states like ours have to do to maintain viable railroad and freight transportation. And as I will mention, I did serve as state rail director back in the 1990s and have an interest in railroading that goes back a lot farther than that. My grandfather on my dad's side came here from Norway back in 1906 and worked on building the railroads as they were moving across South Dakota. And my grandfather on my mom's side actually was killed in a railroading accident. He was a railroader as well. So it's very important to the history of our state. It's very important to the present of our state. And it's going to be very important to the future of our state because our #1 industry is agriculture. So I appreciate you holding this hearing. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here and willing to testify today. Especially want to thank Jerry Cope from Dakota Mill and Grain in Rapid City, South Dakota, who will be testifying on behalf of the National and South Dakota Grain and Feed Associations. Since the beginning of this year, South Dakota and many other states have been particularly challenged by rail service delays, network congestion, and locomotive and rail car shortages, which have affected a wide range of shippers, including the agricultural community. From farmers and grain elevators to auto manufacturers, energy providers, retailers of all kinds, rail transportation challenges have affected the economy nationwide. Higher transportation costs can also increase the cost of products at market and at the point of export, decreasing our global competitiveness. As a former South Dakota rail director under the late Governor George S. Mickelson in the early 1990s, I know firsthand the importance of effective rail access for not only agricultural producers but other shippers. In all my years of working on rail matters, I've never seen producers more concerned than they are now regarding their restricted capability to move grain to the marketplace. It's my hope that this hearing will continue to bring attention to the rail service backlogs that South Dakota shippers and shippers nationwide are currently facing and encourage continued discussion about both short-term and long-term solutions to address these issues. I also want to note that not all of the blame should be placed on the rail carriers because some events have been outside of their control. That being said, these issues did not arise overnight, and some railroads have been better than others at addressing the challenge head-on. In South Dakota alone, this year's harvest and what remains of last year's is expected to exceed the statewide grain storage capacity by as much as 18%. Grain has already been stored on the ground. As you noted from this particular picture right here, that was the wheat harvest that occurred earlier this year. And what's so alarming about that photo is that it happened early in the crop year, and we've got much larger corn and soybean harvests coming on real soon here this fall. Projections from the U.S. Department of Agriculture estimate that South Dakota's 2014 wheat harvest is going to be at 108 million bushels, a 14% increase over the 3-year average, and soybean and corn crops are also expected to be unusually large and potentially record-setting. Even with these high yields, the increased negative basis due to inadequate transportation and the inability to timely move these crops from grain handlers could result in more than $300 million in lost value to South Dakota corn, wheat, and soybean producers. As winter approaches, ethanol plants will also become vulnerable to rail delays. Because of the nature of ethanol production, plants cannot simply be shut down during winter months. South Dakota ethanol producers like Glacial Lakes and Redfield rely upon adequate services to prevent pipes from freezing and major structural damage to their operations. In addition, South Dakota's Big Stone Power Plant has indicated that they're running below capacity because they simply can't get enough coal to fuel the most efficient operation. Coal stockpiles are alarmingly low, and rail service simply hasn't provided adequate coal supplies. The Surface Transportation Board has taken several steps to address these rail service challenges, including issuing a number of orders designed to increase transparency. On June 20th, the board issued a grain order to provide additional transparency and ensure both Canadian Pacific and Burlington Northern Santa Fe railroads had plans for reducing their grain car backlogs. While the STB has been working hard to address the current rail service issues facing South Dakota and other states in the northern tier of the United States, this crisis has highlighted some of the inefficiencies that currently exist at the STB. On Monday, Chairman Rockefeller, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, and I introduced Senate Bill 2777, the Surface Transportation Board Reauthorization Act, which is a first step in addressing these inefficiencies so that the STB can better assist shippers and railroads when problems arise. This hearing marks a continuation of my ongoing efforts to work not only with the STB but with the railroads and the shippers directly to address the challenges that agricultural producers and other businesses have experienced beginning last winter when the harsh cold snarled the movement of trains and causes significant delays that shippers and railroads are still working to remedy. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thanks to our witnesses for being here today and testifying and having what I think is a very important hearing, particularly in light of the economic impacts and consequences that will occur if we aren't able to effectively and in a timely way move the harvest that's coming ahead of us this fall. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could I, while we still have him here, just quickly direct a question to him? Generally, I know you both have had, you had an STB hearing, as you mentioned, last week in North Dakota. Been tracking this issue very carefully for a long time. And the question really has to do with whether you believe action would have been taken as quickly this year by the railroads to address this crisis had it not been for members of Congress and the STB working to you know, help address and deal with those service challenges. And I ask that question because one of the things that we hear is that, you know, the industry is making investment, which they are, but I find it hard to believe that we would have seen the kind of action that we needed to see taken had it not been for the agency and for the attention, obviously, that Congress has paid to this issue.
We've been pretty aggressive on this issue, and BNSF has responded, and they have given us a very detailed plan. Their managing director, Matt Rose, has been up to our state on multiple occasions and has been, even back in February when we were working on catching up on moving fertilizer, they changed their hauling system. They assigned unit trains to move fertilizer and so forth. They came forward with a detailed resource plan. They started reporting their delinquencies on the website. They've reduced their delinquencies to about 1,000 cars right now, about 10 days past due. So they have responded. They have been proactive. That's the concern. And of course, they need to continue to do more, so we're continuing to work with them. But on the CP side, we're not seeing that. Their reporting up until recently is not transparent. We can't tell what their delinquencies are. Now they're reporting about a 7,500 car delinquency, but an average of 13 weeks, so we still can't decipher exactly what that means. They're changing their ordering system. Some of our shippers are worried that they're getting orders canceled. They've talked about a $150 million resource plan this year to catch up, but we don't have the detail or the timelines on that. So what we're saying is, you know, we need, not only do we need to continue to be proactive until we get that, but so does STB. And that's why what you're doing here is on the mark, is to make sure that we're able to take, all of us, including STB, a proactive stance if somebody is not responding proactively to solve what's been a problem, an ongoing problem for a period of time. We get that if the problem just happened, somebody has to react. This has been going on long enough now that that reaction should be in place already.
If I can just add a couple comments to that. I think it's a matter of whether the railroad believes this is permanent, whether this is a one-time glitch in the system or whether we're going to have a need for a permanent increased build-out. And I happen to believe we need a permanent increased build-out. Given the history of siting pipelines in this country, we're going to continue to move oil on the rails. Your committees have already discussed the safety issues, but we're at 1.1 million barrels a day, pretty much in North Dakota. We think that's going to grow another 20–30%. Where's that oil going to move? It's going to move on the tracks. It's going to move in pipelines, but it's also still going to move on the tracks. And so we need to accommodate all the captive shippers. And I believe that without the attention of the congressional delegations in the northern tier, without the focus of the STB, at least as it relates to one railroad, we would not be as far as what we are. But I will tell you that The big concern that I have is that still what we're hearing is they don't get that this is a permanent problem and needs huge amounts of capital infusion in order to solve it.
I thank you. They will claim that they don't have the money, and John Thune and I will jump up and down vigorously and protest if they do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cope, can you kind of help us understand why rail is such an important part of the system for getting the grain harvest to market? What are the costs and benefits relative to other modes of transportation?
Yes, Senator. In the case of South Dakota, and I know I'm talking all about South Dakota, but I think we're indicative of the entire upper Midwest and in some respects the total grain system in the U.S. The problem, if you can call it that with rail, is that it is our central link to many of the exporters. Now, the guys in the central U.S. also have the river, the barges that they can use. But for us in South Dakota, it's just cost prohibitive to go by truck. I know this year truck rates have gone up. Trucks are hard to find. And in the case of some birdseed products that we handle, those are typically sold FOB, which means we sell it to the buyer, he provides the cars. Well, this year, when rail got so backed up, some of these plants were in danger of running out, and this also extended to some corn ethanol plants. They're in danger of running out, so they went out and hired trucks. We had trucks going as far away as Fort Pierce, South Dakota to Georgia to make deadlines at the buyer's expense. Now, it didn't directly come out of our pocket, but his effective rate was 2 to 3 times what the rail rate was. Now, what do you think happened the next time he come around to bid South Dakota grain? I mean, it does come back to haunt us. So that's the problem with the trucks. Another thing that's happened with trucks, it extends to things like some of the DOT rules and regulations that are out. You know, we have a shortage of drivers, and that's real, is getting qualified drivers. But when you have a continued system of more and more regulations that make it real onerous to get those drivers, that's just one more thing in the way. When it comes to the river system, you know, thanks for passing legislation out of the Senate and out of the House to fund some of our locks and dams on the rivers, because we're all of an integrated process, trucks, rail, and barge. So we need that system as well. But in the center part of the United States, like South Dakota, you know, rail is the most efficient, and it's really the only way to get to the market. And so if we don't have that, we don't have an economy. And
we had a big problem in South Dakota this last year during the spring. There was a real concern about getting fertilizer shipments there in time to plant the 2014 crop during that short planting window. And now that the focus is on the harvest this fall, I'm wondering if there are concerns about receiving your fall fertilizer shipments, and if you're working with the railroads to address that.
Well, fortunately, the main fertilizer season is in the springtime, but it is a concern. I mean, if you're backlogged in one commodity, you're backlogged on all. So we have been talking to our suppliers on how to best get it there in the fall. Right now, that's probably the expensive truck option, but it's just something that once that backlog is started, we kind of feel like we're in a 100-meter dash here, but we're starting from the 150-yard line. Is how do we catch up? How do we work through that backlog? And it's going to be fertilizer. If we have any hiccups at all through the winter, it's going to be grain, and we're going to be back to ground zero again next spring.
Mr. Handberger, you talked about Chicago. We hear about Chicago all the time, and I'm wondering what lessons the railroads learned as a result of last winter's impact on rail service, especially through the major hub at Chicago, and if the railroads have implemented any best practices or found any opportunities to improve efficiency that could improve the situation if we experience a similar winter this year or next. What's being done to address this huge sort of choking point we have in Chicago?
What we're doing is trying to coordinate on a much more automated basis the data that each railroad collects on its own. That is to say, how many trains are waiting, how many trains are held for crew, how many trains are coming in from Montana, or when are they expected in? And those will then be, those data will then set up metrics that will trigger automatic rerouting, automatic special handling if they exceed a certain amount. Right now, that is done orally, and the protocols were not as enforceable as they will be this coming year.
Mr. Dooley, you talked about some of the inefficiencies in the chemical industry. Can you describe some of the financial impacts, what that means to some of the folks that you represent?
Well, the study I referenced, and it's in my written as well as my oral testimony, is that when we did an analysis, and it went for 2011, we did a calculation on those shipments that were over 180% of the RVC. That totaled about $4.2 billion in rate, what we would refer to as rate premiums in excess of 180% of the RVC. But what is more troubling to us, as I mentioned, is that it was almost $3 billion of that was 300%, over 300% of the RVC, and that trend line that showed over 50%, almost a 50% increase in a 5-year period of shipments over 300%. Now, I don't want to suggest that, you know, all those rates are inappropriate and are not justified based on market conditions. But what I do suggest is that there's got to be a meaningful recourse for shippers to avail themselves to. And right now, STB has in place, you know, financial impediments to seeking recourse and regulatory impediments seeking to recourse. And so it's, you know, a $4 billion annual hit on our industry is not insignificant. And that is money that's not going into other investments that show a return to our economy.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired. We have other members who are here and want to ask questions. So
We do, and
with respect to the legislation, I think that we had discussed this previously, that the arbitration provisions are voluntary, and I think that's been made explicit. So that should alleviate some of the concerns that were expressed by Mr. Hamburger about our bill. I do think that my observation has been, and I acted once as this arbitration process between serving in the House and serving in the Senate. And the standalone cost model is an extremely time-consuming, expensive, complicated, and difficult process to undertake for a shipper or a shipper group, and particularly a small shipper. And most shippers, as was pointed out, are served by one railroad. And when you have competition, obviously the rate structure is very different. But when you're served by one railroad, that's the mechanism that was put in place to ensure that you know, the STB could be a referee, so to speak, and make sure that that nobody is gaming the system. So I think trying to simplify that, trying to come up with a streamlined way in which shippers could gain access to that process and at least have some of these issues addressed, hopefully resolved, is I think what we're trying to accomplish with the legislation, and I hope in the end we can get some broad bipartisan support for it, because I do think the STB is in need of reform. I think expanding the number of members on the board, allowing for different and better ways in which they can communicate and try and resolve issues, perhaps anticipate, troubleshoot ahead of time. There are some things that we can fix, and that I would hope everybody could get on board with. I just wanted to sort of close this out for the record, to have Mr. Cope explain, because I think this is important, and sometimes I think it gets lost in translation, how the freight cost factors into you know, a typical shipper, and I'll use agriculture because that's what we're most familiar with and that's what you're most familiar with. But in a state like South Dakota, where we've got sort of historically now low commodity prices, cash price of corn is under $3, what, $2.75? On the board it might be $3.50, but what you're able to pay a farmer who brings in a truckload of corn or soybeans to put on the rail to move to its ultimate destination, that's the price that you're going to pay them. And the basis, the transportation or freight cost, is the difference. And we did this a back-of-the-envelope calculation for this year based on the number of bushels we think we're going to produce in South Dakota this year, combined wheat, corn, and soybeans. And what the basis is today, or for delivery in September of this year versus September of 2013, and it's about 28 cents a bushel more for the freight cost, which means that's about $311 million less that's staying in the farm economy and the farmers' pockets at a time when we have historically low commodity prices to start with. So you can see the economic angst that gets created in a state like South Dakota or other states who are experiencing similar difficulties. And I don't confine this just to grain movements. I think it's true for a lot of commodity movements. And, but I'm just, if you could, Mr. Cope, sort of explain how that process works when you as an elevator, as a shipper, how the basis works and what that means in terms of actual dollars and cents going back, staying in the pockets of the farmer versus going into transportation costs. And I might add, when there is shortage of supply of cars or locomotives, high demand, the price goes up. And so you're going to pay more for transportation costs, which means, again, less it stays in the farmer's pockets. So could you just kind of, this is just sort of again, I think this is useful for many of us who don't understand exactly how the economics of this all works, to explain how this impacts a typical farmer in a state like South Dakota.
Sure. Thank you, Senator. Well, as you aptly put it, basis is, it's complicated, but it's simple all at once. It's the difference between the underlying futures market and the cash price. Well, where that comes from, it's basically transportation, it's the elevator's margin, and those are really the two things. Transportation all along the way, but anything that affects transportation is going to go into that bucket. So, you're right. There's a lot of things that affect basis, weather, demand, time of year, but I think it's pretty clear that if you look back over time, or even look, not even to last year, just from April till now, that the overall basis level has widened. And I wouldn't want to get into an argument about hard numbers. I think the important things are the trends, the trends of that. And so the basis has widened, and that means less price paid to the farmer, because if you got your futures market here, you got your cash price here, the difference is the basis. So if the cost of freight goes up relative to everything else, and that has to lower the cash price, as less price in the farmer's pockets. It depends on the day. I guess you use the figure of 28. I did some looking, putting this testimony together, pretty quickly come up with 30 to 35 cents. It's ranged as much as 50 or 60. It's ranged as little as 10. I will say that the commercial elevators absorbed a lot of that increase in cost of freight through the winter and spring in general, because uncertainty on when's it going to snap back, competitive issues, a whole host of things, and some just trying to be fair. So as the cost of freight went up, that the basis had to go down to account for that. Now, when I talk about cost of freight, there's two things in there. One is the tariff rates, and on grain in particular, it's all tariff-based. You can go on any railroad's website and see what the rates are from point A to point B. They also charge a fuel surcharge based on highway fuel that is tacked onto that rate. And then in the case of the Burlington Northern, people will buy freight commitments for a year, or maybe a shorter time. But most commonly, they'll buy freight commitments for a year, and they'll pay, and that's an auction. You can go on BN's website and see what the history of their auctions were. As you own that freight, when I talked about freight being a tool, and now it's become a hard limit on that impacts your ability to do business, companies would buy that deck of freight thinking, I know I'm going to need some over the course of a year, but I don't know exactly when I'm going to need it, so I'm going to tie into this bucket of freight, and then I'll trade in and out of it as time goes. So if I come to a time where you need it, I don't, I might sell you that train commitment, and vice versa. I'd buy it back from you when I need it. That price fluctuates up and down, and the main thing that drives that is car availability. Weather will impact it, but car availability is what drove it this last winter. We had cars, when I said cars traded in that secondary market, the same as the tariff rate, they're trading up to $5,000 a car. We were kind of talking about it the other day. That's like every car you see in that train is like buying an acre of land in central South Dakota. It's a lot of money. I mean, you're talking millions just for the right to ship that train. So somebody's got to pay that. Now, it might be the commercial elevator, it might be the farmer. In this case, it's been a combination of both. Somebody's got to account for that, because no matter what you paid for that commitment, that's a check you write, but you also have to pay the railroad their tariff rate. So that makes sense. That's kind of how that cost of freight can fluctuate. Now, the railroads will argue that that secondary market doesn't go to them. You know, that $5,000 a car did not go to them, and they're absolutely correct. It didn't. But what it did do, when we rolled around to this summer and the freight for this next year was up for auction, people were nervous. They were scared. You know, are we going to get freight? Are we not? So what they've done is translated that secondary cost of freight into the primary auction that went back to the railroad. Looking back just since January 1, the Burlington Northern has collected over $160 million in that. Now, I'm not going to argue that that's bad. It's free market, it's free world. People bid that. But the underlying thing is the uncertainty and unpredictability of railroad performance is what drove that. Now, somebody's got to pay that bill, and like I said, it ended up being a shared cost. I mean, those premiums are being paid for trains. That's either something grain companies have to absorb. I can guarantee you that grain margins aren't good enough to handle all that. So it gets passed back to the farmer. So I think those costs are real. And like I said, I wouldn't get hung up on whether it's 28 cents or 30 or 40, but I think in general, if you ballparked it at 30 to 50 cents a bushel, that's a real impact, and that's out of the farmer's pocket.
And that's an increase when you say 30 to 50 cent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Not
increase in effective freight, right. Decrease in effective cash price paid to the farmer.
Right. And the numbers I used were based on a September delivery for corn to an elevator in central South Dakota, based on 13 rates and what we think the 14 rate is going to be, and that's the 28 cent number I came up with. But at that rate, you're talking again about $311 million less in the farm economy, in the farmers' pockets, and more in transportation, which again, as you point out, I mean, there are lots of factors that contribute to that, but that's what we're talking about here. When you have a shortage, you don't have the availability of cars, the price goes up, and that has very real-world consequences, which is why so many of my constituents and the others who were represented here today spoke out, because they're hearing the same things that we are, and they're particularly concerned about car availability with what we expect is going to be a bumper crop coming in here in the next few weeks, and what that might mean to the basis again, and how that's going to impact the ultimate return that a farmer receives. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you. I appreciate all of you sharing your thoughts today. I hope that we can work in a constructive way to try and resolve some of these issues, and I think our legislation, the STB reforms, are an attempt to do that. Perhaps not a perfect attempt. It never is, but if we can get folks to work with us, I think we can come up with a more efficient, hopefully, system that better recognizes some of these issues in advance and hopefully avoids and prevents some of the disruptions that we've seen in the last year in my state and other states. So thank you.
Well